I had a pretty radical conversion in college, power encounter with God, where God opened my eyes to many of the things that I was doing actually in my sex life, and kind of like a woman at the well sort of experience, which I really define as like my bottom. Like I really hit bottom with drugs, with sex, and then in a day, in a moment, God opened my eyes to see who Jesus was, what I'd been doing, how it hurt so many people, and why he was really the only answer to my problems. And so from there, I thought with such a powerful encounter, especially in my sexual life, that things would be so much easier and effortless. And I found that that actually wasn't the case. And, I had great mentors who told me, hey, read these scriptures, pray these prayers, let's meet together and have breakfast and accountability, let's do men's retreats, and none of those things were actually really effective for me. And so it led me down a path, actually, a scary path, where when it wasn't effective, I thought, is it my faith worthless or is God worthless? Which was a really terrifying thing to think, given the powerful experience I had had with God. And it was in some ways actually traumatic because it actually touched on my deep fear of when I lost my dad when I was 8. I'd always interpreted that as kids do, there was something about me. And so this idea of failing God and failing in this way repeatedly really, in some ways, kept that toxic shame alive in me. And it wasn't until actually I became a counselor that I realized there's a totally different way to think about this. Yes, there's a spiritual formation issue, but there's actually a disease aspect to this issue as well. And when you think about it from a disease perspective, and you wonder, how did Jesus relate to people who had diseases? And you think about the moments where his guts are moved with compassion for people with diseases, that he reaches out to be with them, and he extends to be with them in their pain and their suffering. And so that helped me understand, okay, that's why I've been stuck. I need to think about it not just from a spiritual formation issue, but from a disease issue as well. And diseases like addiction are things that require treatment and a lot of structure to overcome. And so that's where my story and my work collided, I think, to bring that message to the church as well as to my clients so that they know where to relate to this issue from a spiritual formation issue and where to relate this issue from a disease issue. The question is, how would I define pornography? I define pornography as anything that you use for sexual stimulation. And so that could be books, that could be images, that could be audio. There's endless amounts of ways to be sexually stimulated, and all of that could be considered pornography. We got to remember where the teenage brain is at. It is like a Ferrari engine with Kia brakes. And so the adolescent brain is pumping out a bunch of dopamine. Dopamine is what drives learning and wiring in the brain. And the thing that drives dopamine is this idea of novelty. Novelty is a new pleasure, and that could be really anything. It could be a new image. It could be if somebody liked your post. It's any sense of reward or affirmation or stimulation. And so pornography is obviously filled with all of that. On the internet, you can click and you can click and you can click and you can click and you can click. And so you can keep actually this dopamine going at a soaring rate for hours and hours and hours. That's all called super novelty. The other way that pornography wires the brain is through this idea of super stimulus. This comes from a very crazy experiment where this guy, Nico, a very smart guy, a Nobel Prize winner for this, he took plastic butterflies and regular female butterflies and put them in a cage. Then he let male butterflies into the cage, and none of the male butterflies wanted to interact with the actual real female butterflies. They all went to the plastic female butterflies because he had enhanced them and took their sexual attributes to another level. And so one way that we've thought about, why are we seeing so much sexual dysfunction and erectile dysfunction from pornography? It really comes from this idea, pornography is a supernormal stimulus. It's our plastic butterfly. in a sense, where if you have kids, teens especially, growing up where, again, they're wiring their brain to a screen, not an actual person, their brain tells them sex equals screen. And that becomes sex in their mind. So that's the second way. The third way is through associations, and this is comes from Pavlov's experiment, where he fed a dog, rang a bell, and he kept doing that, and then eventually he just rang a bell, and the dog salivated. And so the dog's brain basically said that the bell equaled food. Now, if your first experience is with pornography, you're alone, you're isolated, you're feeling shock, you're feeling confusion, all of that gets wired into an association in your mind. You have the sex hardware, but it's looking for the software. So your mind says sex equals shame, sex equals isolation, sex equals, maybe if you do it when you're bored, sex equals bored. Maybe it happens to be if you're in your room alone, your mind will tell you that the right thing to do right now is to look at porn because it's formed that association. And so those are the three ways that pornography can wire the brain. There's more ways than that, but those are the three dominant ways that parents and teens need to be aware of. Along the lines of how does the good part of this wiring process happen, you can think of academics as an example. If you study and you do well on a test, you get an A, the teacher is proud of you, you get a reward from that. Similarly, like an image or somebody liking your post, there's a good feeling that comes with academic achievement. That's dopamine. And so now your brain says, that was a good experience, that was a helpful experience, let's remember and repeat that process. And at first, it's a very conscious and intentional process. You have to try to develop that pathway, even though there is a reward. But soon it goes from conscious to unconscious, right? You're studying, you're doing all these things, not because you're trying hard to do them. You're doing them because your brain has reorganized itself around academic achievement. And so that's how the brain rewires itself around a helpful thing. And it does this in lots of different areas. Driving is another one. At first when you start to learn how to drive, you're constantly paying attention to 100 different things. But all of a sudden those 100 different things get processed in your mind so you don't have to think about them anymore. And so that's very helpful. So you can actually have a conversation with your wife on the way to filming a film about pornography instead of thinking about trying not to hit the car next to you. Trying to understand what's the difference between addiction and habit is very, very important. I think especially when you're thinking about it in the discipleship realm. Habit really can be anything good or bad. But the difference between a habit and an addiction is addiction has begun to not only take control of your behavior, it's in control of you rather than you in control of it, but that is actually causing damage to several different areas of your life. It's causing damage potentially to your finances, to your physical health, to your occupational health, and to your emotional health. And usually for addiction to really stand and to say this is an addiction, it has to be in at least 3 of those areas. If it's maybe just damaging your emotional health, but not damaging the rest of the areas, you say, well, depending on the extent of what that emotional damage might be, maybe you just feel down some days whenever you do that habit. Then you treat that as a habit, and you maybe work on that at a habit level with maybe reading about it or getting extra support from a person, but you wouldn't classify that as an addiction. Addiction is a little bit more heavy duty. It's causing havoc in a lot of areas of your life. So it's really important for us to understand the difference between purity, sexual integrity, and sexual discipleship. I lean towards sexual discipleship for a couple different reasons. One reason is the biological mismatch that we're currently in. Our biology tells us we should be having sex around 12, 13, 14 years old. But culturally and spiritually, we're saying, we don't have the wisdom really to live out being parents at that age or being in a committed relationship at that age. And so the idea of sexual discipleship is to say, how do we work with that biological mismatch? How do we not view it as a black and white issue, but how do we look at it as a developmental issue? So for example, if it's sexual discipleship, we want to start giving the narrative of what sex is when people are 3, 4, 5, and continually. as they grow, so that they begin to understand the meaning and boundaries around sex and be able to connect it with what's happening with their body. You can also think about it from, financial discipleship. Most people are not tithing, right? And if they do, it's not 10%. We don't necessarily freak out the way we do around that as we do with purity, right? We say, okay, how do we get people to be more generous? How do we get people to understand the promises of God? How do we help people take the next step that they need to take in this journey of understanding what human flourishing looks like in this area? And so when we're think about discipleship, we think about it within the context and meet people where they're at and try to bring them to the next step in that journey. When you think about applying sexual discipleship, to, let's say, a teen whose body is saying that they need to have sex, and maybe they were exposed to pornography when they're 8 years old, and their brain is wired to think that that's sex, and they're went from habituated to it to addicted. If you come at them from a purity standpoint and say, well, hey, you just need to stop today. And if you don't stop today, again, we're back to, it means that you're really not trusting God, right? Versus putting on from a discipleship perspective, where is this person? Is this a spiritual issue? Is this a disease issue? How do we connect with them where they're at and say, okay, why don't we just get you to begin to be honest? That's the first part of the discipleship process, is just learn to be honest. Let's not worry about the wins and losses right now. If you don't have honesty, and if you're filled with shame, you can't really move anywhere else in your discipleship. So let's just start there. Just show up, be honest, and let's talk about what's happening and what you're learning from it. And when you do that, then we'll take the next step. The question, are boundaries enough? I would say boundaries are not enough. I see parents who are doing all of the right things when it comes to sexual discipleship, and in the end, I still see their kids, falling into the pitfalls of this age in that area. And so even though they know the boundaries, they've been given good kind of sexual discipleship education, they still find themselves, falling in these pitfalls. So what matters most to me is not the boundaries. You need to know those boundaries, and you need to teach those boundaries, and they are helpful. But to me, the critical thing, again, is there somebody in that person's life that they can have a sexual discipleship conversation with? Because, again, if they're addicted and they've been, interacting with girls on the internet, and then they go into a dating relationship and they've learned no boundaries in the digital world, how do you expect them to have boundaries in the physical world, right? And so from a sexual discipleship perspective, you want to say, well, let's look at the whole picture. Again, what does it look like to meet you where you started in this journey, and then to help you take the next step? And so boundaries are usually, I think, not enough for somebody growing up in the digital age. I think the most important thing parents can do is, to give them an understanding of what human flourishing looks like in the sexual realm. You can only know what counterfeit is if you've been exposed to the original. And so that's the most important thing, is to start there. Because then when you go to talk about pornography, you can kind of talk about it as a counter-narrative, right? The counter-narrative to porn is, objectification, isolation, commodification, right, of sex. And so start with the original porn in contrast to that, but then also from the sexual discipleship perspective, letting them know that it's going to be a hard journey. There's a biological mismatch, and there's going to be trips, there's going to be setbacks, and there's going to be falls. And the really most important thing is that you feel like you have somebody to talk to about all of those things in your life. And you need to ask them, do you feel comfortable enough to have a conversation with me, with the youth pastor? Is the church kind of just modeling vulnerability in that area? And I'll say this, if there isn't really a reference point outside of the family, like maybe dad has done a great job of talking about his experience, and you've read some books together, and it feels like there's a good conversation. If there isn't another reference point like in a youth group setting or somewhere else where it's just comfortable to talk about all aspects of the sexual discipleship journey, even the falls and the setbacks, it'll make it much more difficult for that teen to come and tell that parent when they struggle. I've seen it over and over, those two reference points of saying, hey, like, this is a hard journey, it's okay to talk about this, those both need to be intact. So if your church isn't really modeling that, then that would be a really important conversation. Maybe you share this video with them and say, hey, we need to really figure out how to take our conversation from a purity or sexual integrity conversation to a sexual discipleship conversation. So recently, and this is really good news actually, the World Health Organization finally has enough research and confidence to say that sexual addiction, sexual compulsivity is a real disease. Now, what a lot of academics have found is that people who are Christian or religiously conservative think they are addicted to the tune of like 70%, versus the general population might define themselves, if they're in that realm, as like 20 or 30% of them are addicted. And so what they've done with this is they said, you can't just say you're addicted because your faith teaches you not to do it and you do it over and over again, right? This goes to this idea of, is it a spiritual formation issue or is it a disease, right? Do you need to go to a pastor or do you need to go to a hospital, right? And we have this sort of understanding, right, with diabetes, right? If somebody has diabetes and their biology is off, we say, okay, you need to go to a doctor, you need to learn how to eat healthy, you need to exercise, you need to learn to stay away and have these boundaries in your life, and if you do those things, you can be a healthy person. And if a Christian does that, and even if they struggle, and let's say they don't follow those boundaries, we don't necessarily judge them, right? Because we understand they have a disease and they're working on it and it's hard. So that's why I think we have to really be thoughtful around sexual addiction and when we define it as an addiction versus a bad habit or a moral issue that we have. If it is an addiction, then yes, then let's think about it like diabetes. This person, yes, needs to talk to the pastor, but they also need to talk to a professional to help them, again, figure out what is going to be their treatment program. And so, in some ways, right, it's really great news to have the World Health Organization say this really is a thing, it really is a disease, but it doesn't discount that, I've seen really the best results is when people combine these two aspects, the spiritual formation as well as the disease aspect. In some ways, it's the 12-step model is really a combination of those two things. And so, yeah, it's big news, and we should all be aware of it. So the big M. Everybody always wonders, what do you think about masturbation? If I was at my professional counseling conference, it means one thing for somebody who's become addicted. It means something else for somebody who's not. Completely laying off any of the Christian framework to the side, I would say, again, as long as it's not hurting your job, your academics, your emotional health, etc., then we'd say, okay, like, put that in the habit, moral framework if you want, work on it. If we're thinking about it from a spiritual formation issue, again, we have to be aware of this biological mismatch. The best explanation I've seen on this really comes from this idea of letting your body kind of do the work for you. Our body will make us have an orgasm when our body says it's time. And we can just, ride that biological wave, and that's fine. Now, when you start to bring in fantasy and then pornography and other images, that's where it's crossed over into that spiritual formation issue, right? Because C.S. Lewis has a great quote about this. It's like, in fantasy, there's a danger to believe that you are in control, and it can become a selfish sexuality, potentially. And we just need to be aware of that aspect, and that's in the spiritual formation realm. But for somebody who's addicted, I say, hey, you may want to consider not having any solo sex at all if you're married. Like, have every orgasm in your life from this point forward be relational. So it really depends on where people are at. Where does sex addiction come from, and can it come from pornography use, is a really important question because It used to be that sex addiction was primarily something that was rooted in trauma or abuse. The first question that you're asked on the sex addiction assessment is, were you sexually abused? And so a lot of people would think about sex addiction as, in some ways, like a reenactment of the trauma, of the shame around sexuality. It didn't have to necessarily be sexual abuse, but some form of trauma. What happened, though, in 2006 and a little bit before that is when internet porn companies got really, really good at figuring out how to get people to stay longer and longer and longer and more engaged with pornography. All of a sudden, people who had no trauma or abuse in their life were now coming into our offices saying that they'd gone way past porn into escorts and all sorts of stuff that traditional sex addicts would go to. And it was really confusing for the clinical community for a while. But what we've begun to understand is that actually early and often exposure to pornography in some ways is itself a trauma. When you have unfiltered access to anything and everything on the web at 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, even adults, there's just stuff on there that our brain was never meant to be able to process. It's kind of like trans fat for the mind. I would see this in my practice where, a lot of the guys who are maybe 50 and above, they started their sex addiction pre-internet in some ways, and actually porn doesn't really do it for them. And it's really not even a part of their process. Like, in some ways you can think about it like if they're heroin addicts, they're not going to go smoke weed. They're just going straight to heroin. However, pornography, there's many different flavors and shades of that. And so what I've begun to see is that pretty much if you grew up somewhat in the digital age, maybe you're 20 or 30, you are going to be hijacked by pornography if you don't have any abuse or trauma in your life. You could just be isolated in the sense of you feel like you don't have many friends. You could, not have a really strong marriage and be susceptible. And so people with, pretty good, strong integrity their whole life will come in and say, hey, I've been married 10 years. I've been doing great. And now all of a sudden, I went from watching some pornography and now I'm chatting with women online, and I don't know how I got there. And what they find out is, well, it just started with the porn habit that turned into an addiction, which then all addictions want more. So I came into college really a really strong spiritual seeker. I started attending these different guru meetings. I was really into meeting with this Buddhist monk guy. And then I saw that there was a InterVarsity Christian Fellowship table, and I had some exposure to youth group. And I thought, that's going to be a fun, cool thing to do. And so, just signing up for any and everything, and did that my freshman year. And the next day, the small group leader came to my dorm and took me on a mountain bike ride, and I was like, yeah, this is cool. And so Jesus was one of the people that I was interested in. But at the same time, really, I believed that I was God, more in the Hindu tradition, and therefore it didn't really matter what I did or didn't do. That finally caught up to me my junior year, where I decided, after reading the Buddha story, who spent, months and years with prostitutes as part of his enlightenment journey, I was like, let me just open the door here. No restraints, no convictions, no morality, nothing. And I ended up hooking up with basically what I would consider what they call family. Like, my family was broken, and so I made this friend group my family. And I ended up hooking up with my girlfriend's best friend, my best friend's sister, his girlfriend, and I basically destroyed every relationship that I really had at that time, and that mattered to me. But I didn't really have any conviction about it until I went to an InterVarsity meeting, and everybody's singing worship songs and all that, and I'm just feeling this like utter hatred towards everybody and everything in that moment. And I just take a moment, I say, God, like, why do I feel so much hatred right now? And then literally just a kind of a snap of a finger, it was like there was this curtain shielding me from understanding who I was from God's perspective, and it just got moved, and I really saw that I was wicked, And I heard that. I heard God say, because you're wicked. I've never heard God say anything like that to me since then. But that's what it took for me. And I literally fell to my knees and just started weeping. And it was, like a Paul on the road kind of moment. And all of those other deities and other ways that I followed, it's like they all melted like snow in that moment, because I saw that I didn't just need like some more wisdom. Like I needed a whole new me. And I saw that there was only one person, Jesus, who offered that. And all of a sudden, all the things I'd learned about Jesus, all just like, man, they all came into clarity, into focus, all in that moment. I was like, oh, that's why the cross. Oh, that's why the Holy Spirit. I get it. Following that powerful moment, one of the wonderful things is my mentor and the guy who'd really stuck with me through that whole journey, he let me share all my stuff and accepted me where I was. Now, again, as I actually grew in leadership, he said, hey, you have to follow some boundaries. And that's where I started to wrestle with, is my faith worthless or is God worthless because I'm doing these spiritual formation things and I don't know if they're really helping in this area. But even in the midst of that, I think my mentor really had a sexual discipleship framework, and I was able to be honest with him. Not without consequence, but I felt that there was that right balance of grace and truth. And so that really helped me come out from underneath the shame. And the very interesting and cool thing was, in that process of being able to be honest with him and coming out from that shame, I was able to actually go back to these people I'd betrayed so deeply and tell them my story, tell them what happened, and then they came to faith. Yeah, if a parent or a teen comes to me with, hey, I've been looking at porn on average 4 hours, masturbating 3 times, I would say in my mind first, well, there's probably a lot more you're doing that you don't feel comfortable sharing yet if you're doing that. And so I keep that in the back of my mind. And then I try to make it as safe as possible and let them know that, they're not alone. And the most important thing you can do is be honest, and you're only sick as your secrets in this process. And then invite them just to share more, like when did it happen? And when did it start? And how are you feeling about it? I think as soon as the door is cracked, people do want to share. And so as a parent, I would say, do what you can to crack open that door. As a teen, look for the cracked doors when they're open and take that risk and share your story. The message of this age regarding sexuality is basically embedded in self-actualization, right? It's like the thing that we should all be dedicated to as individuals is to maximize our potential in every area, which sounds like a pretty good idea if you think about it. But when you put it in this kind of the sex category, there's a lot of different ways that you can define what achieving your potential is in that realm. Maybe it's, I'm going to use sex to boost my self-esteem, and so I'm going to do 3 Tinder dates a week. And if I do 2, I don't feel as great. And if I do 4, it feels too much. So, my self-actualization is 3 a week. And so that's the self-actualization paradigm. God has a really different paradigm. His is self-transcendence, right? It's not just about you feeling full and complete. It's really about a fullness and a completeness that actually creates a ripple and multi-generational effect of life and human flourishing. I love the question about singleness. What about single people who don't want to get married, don't have an intent to be married, or just for whatever reason are not married? I actually think, Jesus really raises the bar on marriage, so much so that in the Bible, the disciples have a freak-out moment. They say, hey, Jesus, this other teacher says, hey, you can actually get divorced and remarry, if there's an affair or something happens. And Jesus says, that's actually not the original design. The original design is, monogamy, I don't like divorce, that's how it was meant to be. And the disciples say, who the heck can accomplish that? And they freak out on Jesus. They say, this is impossible. And that's where one of the famous, what's impossible for man is possible for God. It's in this context, this idea that disciples are thinking about, man, like being committed to one person is an extremely high level of discipleship. And then that's where Jesus goes in to talk about eunuchs and people being, basically, he's giving these different categories that, some are called to be single or eunuchs in a sense, or they were born eunuchs. And he gives, these different examples to say, just as there is a high bar for marriage, it's not the easy path. There's also a high bar for people who are single. It's all a high bar. And actually, that really sets, I think, the right conversation and stage for, if as a church we want to be trying to speak to what human flourishing is in the sexual realm, we need to honor the high bar in all those different areas. It's really important to understand the opposite of addiction. A lot of people would say, well, the opposite of addiction is sobriety. But that's actually not quite true. Our original idea of addiction came from this rat study where they put a rat in a cage by itself with water and drug water. And in that study, all the rats overdose. And so, the researchers said, okay, yeah. So the problem is the drug itself, and the drug gets people hooked, and they can't stop, and they'll die. And so that's kind of the just say no, and actually a lot of the war on drugs comes from that research. Another researcher, unfortunately, in the 70s, decades after that was established, said, this is kind of an unnatural environment. What if we put a rat, not by itself in a cage, because that's not a natural environment for a rat. Let's put it with its tribe of rats, put some activities, some food, some balls, and the same water and drug water. None of the rats overdosed. And so that scientist thought, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. That when we have happy and healthy connected lives, right, to ourselves, to peers, to our environment, then all of a sudden that drug water seems less appealing. In fact, it actually gets in the way of our connection. So in some ways it becomes a threat to what we value rather than a draw. And so when I try to help people understand their way out of addiction or a way to prevent it, I say, hey, you got to have these 5 C's of connection down, right? You have to be connected to yourself, right? You need to understand what's going on, your emotions, your thoughts, and be able to communicate them. You need to practice healthy habits like exercise and make sure that yourself is healthy. You need to be connected to peers, people that you can feel like you can be honest with, you can live life with. You need to be connected to loved ones in the right way, like your family, your parents, your significant other. You need to be able to have a happy, healthy, connected life with them, with God, and also guides, because you're going to need some mentors in the sexual discipleship realm, because you're not always going to be perfect, and you should count on not being perfect. And if you don't have a mentor guide who you can be fully, absolutely honest with, because you may not be able to, from the first get-go, be honest with your peers or with your parents or your significant other, that guide will be the one that leads you to connect with the rest of those C's. And so often I end up being that guide, and it's an honor to be. When it comes to seeing somebody who really walks the sexual discipleship path, what I've seen over and over in the teen program that I've run is that there's a stark contrast of success based on the father's level of engagement. Back to that whole connection thing. Yes, you can have peers. Yes, you can have me as a guide, but maybe once a week. Maybe you can have a youth pastor you see once in a while. But the father who's at home and engaged and kind of checking in and talking with their son, pretty much 9 times out of 10, they got to that 90 days without acting out and beyond, which is really what you're trying to get to. It's like, can you get to 30 days? Can you get to 60 days? Can you get to 90 days? So this starts to become less of a powerful grip in your mind. And engaged fathers were the difference. It'd be the same with mothers and daughters. It's really about that daily check-in process that leads the way to freedom. So when it comes to this idea, right, of disease, we see Paul talking about it in Scripture. Timothy and Paul are both miracle workers. Yet, what does Paul say when Timothy's stomach is bothering him chronically? He says, why don't you drink some wine, right? He doesn't say necessarily, hey, gather everybody around, and if a miracle doesn't happen, Timothy, it means there's something wrong with your faith, buddy. He says, drink some wine. There's something going on, maybe a disease in your stomach, and that was the medicine of the day. And so back to understanding as a parent, as a teen, as a pastor, being able to evaluate, is this teen or is this person struggling, again, with a spiritual formation issue? Or, in a sense, do they need wine? Do they need medicine because this is transition into a disease that needs to be taken care of and approached in a fully compassionate and different way? So for a long time, I didn't understand the second part of the life verse that I felt like I got from God. The first part comes from Malachi 4, where it's very familiar, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. And I took that to mean, God will help heal me, and through healing me, I'll be able to have a more right relationship with him. Because of the trauma and abuse that had happened in my life, my understanding of myself and God were skewed. And through the healing that God did in my life, I began to understand more and more who I was and who God was, and therefore have a right relationship in the process. But the other part of that verse, towards the end, it talks about, how we'll know that Jesus is for real and he's back, is that the parents' hearts will turn to their kids and the kids to the parents. And so that I didn't begin to understand until I started doing this teen program. And when I started to see that, man, the fathers and mothers that are engaged in a daily, weekly, loving way with boundaries with their kids, those were the ones that were successful and effective in growing through their pornography addiction. And so that's when the light bulb went off, that really it is the power, I think, especially for teens, it's in the relationship with the parents. That is the key. That is the most important relationship to have right in this process. And so if you're a parent, I know that's a heavy responsibility. That feels like a heavy burden. But what I've seen over and over again, you don't have to know the way. You don't have to know all the right steps. You just have to say, hey, I'm here, I'm willing. Find a guide who knows what they're doing, and they will help you to figure out how to have that heart turning towards one another in this process. What happens when you have an absent father, a father who's absent either in body or mind and spirit? Because you can have a father around, but not necessarily around. For me, my dad left the family when I was 8. At that time, right, your father is Superman. And so when Superman says, I'm leaving this family, you start to feel very alone in the world, especially because as a boy, you're starting to figure out, what does it mean to be a man in the world? And you look to your father, you look to Superman to show you those things. And so it was traumatic. I'm not going to lie. I actually used to pray to God every day until my dad left. And then I stopped talking to God. So in a sense, I lost both fathers in that time. And really, it's been a journey of still coming back. My mind's first direction when I wake up in the morning is to feel fatherless. That is the first impulse I have. It's really an act of faith for me to believe like I'm not fatherless. It's an act of faith for me to believe that someone is intentionally aware and thinking about me and wants to do good in my life. That's an act of faith that I still, every day, I have to wrestle with because of that experience. At the same time, God redeems that doubt in a sense because it keeps me seeking and searching. And I think that's okay. When it comes to what could I have done differently in the kind of development of my sexuality, I'm not too sure if there's a good answer for that. I think that, again, back to why the parents turning their hearts to the kids and the kids to the parents is so critical as part of actually growing and becoming the person God wants you to be, is I don't think there's any counterfeit that will work. There's no substitute for that. And that's real talk, as they say. A lot of parents who have young kids want to understand, what do I do? I understand that there's a bunch of stuff that can go wrong, but how do I help it go right? The most important thing is to begin to have sex discussions, from the age of 3 to 4 to 5, all the way through, and it never really ends. You should be having just really open, clear, concrete, meaningful conversations about sex. And probably what that's going to bring up for you is some shame, some discomfort, some embarrassment, because that didn't happen for you. And so that's just going to be one of the tensions that you'll experience in this, but I invite you to lean in and lean through it. Now, you may have some sexual trauma in your life, which makes this an unbearable conversation, let alone that it wasn't modeled to you. In that case, I would say I would definitely talk to a pastor or counselor to work through that, because really what we're doing as parents is we want to be the parent we want our kids to be when they grow up, right? As much as we can. And that means facing our shadows and facing the hard stuff. And so if you need to do some work on yourself, do that. You don't have to be perfect, but start it so that you begin having these conversations throughout the kid's life, answering their questions. You want as much as possible to be their Google when it comes to sex rather than Google when it comes to sex. So that's on the what can you do, or what you should strive for with younger kids. If you're like, oh man, we have a 14-year-old and who's had unfettered access to the internet, what do we do now? That's, you're going to have to probably walk some things back, but probably the first thing is just to acknowledge that this is what should have happened. So let's pick up the pieces where we can, but let's have some frank and honest conversations about where you're at today, as much as we can. Or if you feel uncomfortable starting there, like, who would you feel comfortable having that conversation with? And if they say no one, then that's a bigger problem, right? That's where it's so important to have uncles and youth pastors and other people in their life, other than you, regardless, to really be a safe place where they can start to have real questions answered, rather than, again, the internet answering their questions. So now, what will actually be the hardest part of the, oh no, the cat's out the bag situation is you want to monitor the internet activity of your kids. When they're young, 8 and under, you're going for more of a blocking sort of situation where, no internet access, or if it's accessed, you're like watching it, or it's really, you're just really in a kind of build the wall kind of mode. Again, you're trying to prevent any of that trauma that can happen when kids get exposed to stuff on the internet. But that's no way to live, right, forever, because kids are going to move out and live their lives, and you want them to know how to make thoughtful and wise decisions. And so from 8 to 10 on, and there's no right age, you want to begin to figure out, what does it mean to license the digital realm to my kid? Just like with a car, right? First you have to study, then you may get a permit if you are in enough classes, and then if that goes well, driver's training, driver's ed, where somebody's watching you drive. So that's kind of monitoring what their internet activity is. When you're teaching your kids how to drive, you want to make sure that they're turning the right blinker and turning right, rather than, you may sometimes see them turning the right blinker, but actually turning left. And when they do that, of course, you want to be able to know that happened and then talk about it so that they can learn the right way to drive. And similar with the internet, right? They're going to definitely click the right blinker and turn left a lot of times. And if you don't know that, how can you help them become digital citizens in all the healthy ways and privileges that come with using the internet? And so that's not an easy process, and there's definitely places and resources you can go for that. Like access.org is a great one, where they help you facilitate these conversations around digital licensing. That's obviously beyond just pornography, but pornography is a big part of that discussion.